A young couple got married, and after the wedding they held a reception at the bride's grandmother's house. All their family members and friends arrived, and they laughed, danced and sang long into the light. After the wedding reception, the guests decided to play a game of hide and seek. The groom covered his eyes and began counting till 100 while his new bride and all the guests ran out of the room looking for somewhere to hide. Eventually the groom had found everyone except his beautiful bride. Now the other guests also began calling her name out and searched everywhere for the young woman. They began to grow more and more uneasy as they could not find any trace of her. Eventually everyone gave up searching and everybody assumed that the girl had run away and left her husband. As weeks went by, the husband also accepted that his beautiful wife must have had second thoughts about their marriage and had run away. He also finally decided to forget about her and go on with his life. A few years later, a cleaning lady was just cleaning the storeroom when she came across an old trunk. Out of curiosity, she opened it up. Inside the trunk, she found a rotting corpse of a young woman still dressed in a bridal gown. There was a wedding ring on one bony finger, but it was the bride that was missing. The police figured after investigation that she must have hidden herself inside the trunk and accidentally locked it from outside. It was totally impossible to tell if she died of suffocation or she starved to death, but her face was frozen in the silent scream. When I was a child, my family moved to a big old two-floored house with big empty rooms and creaking floorboards. Both my parents worked, so I was alone when I came back from school. One early evening when I came home from school, the house was still dark, so I called out, "Mom?" She answered me in a very singing kind of a voice, as if she was singing or something. She said, "Yes?" Her voice came from the upper portion of the house, so I started going upstairs and I called her out once again. Now I know my mom very well and she gets very annoyed when you ask once or twice the same thing. But to my surprise, this time she did not get annoyed or anything, she just replied once again, "Yes?" It did sound a little strange and creepy, but I did not give it much of an attention because we were just decorating at that time and I thought she might just be happy. Because we had just moved into our new house, I did not know my way around the maze of rooms that was upstairs, but she was in one of the far ones right down the hall. I felt a little uneasy, but I figured that it was just natural, so I rushed my way forwards to Mom, knowing that her presence would calm my fear down, just as a mother's presence always does. Just as I reached for the handle of the door to let myself into the room, I heard the front door downstairs open and my mother called, "Sweetie, are you home?" She said that in a very cheery kind of a voice, and I instantly knew that it was her. I jumped back right away, startled a little, and ran downstairs to her. As I glanced back from the top of the stairs, the room of the door slowly opened a crack. For a brief moment, I saw something strange there, and I'm not very sure what it actually was, but it was staring at me. I'm pretty sure about that, because I still sometimes have nightmares about that, even 10 years later. I bought a new house in a small town in the outdistricts of London. The house was actually very cheap, but the most important part was that I needed to get away from the city and the city life, perhaps. A few months ago, I had a run-in with a stalker. While I had managed to get him arrested, I really could not shake the feeling of his eyes, that they were just constantly watching me. After a certain point, I started to have a feeling that there were eyes everywhere, at home and on the street, always watching me. So finally I had decided to move on to countryside, somewhere where there were less people, just for the peace of mind. The house itself was big and somewhat old, but otherwise very welcoming. The agent who introduced me to the house was required to mention that a serial killer had lived there in the past. This was obviously because of the legal implications, and that was the reason why the house was so cheap. However, my agent as well as later my neighbor Sarah both told me to pay no attention to the thought. 4 other owners had lived in the house since then, and all of them were very happy with it. I personally actually loved the house. The interior furnishings were beautiful and very comfortable. The people of the town were actually very friendly. They often would bring over freshly baked pastries or invite me over for dinners. Get-togethers, they said, were the key to making sure that everyone who lived in the town loved it there. Yet, only after a week, I stopped loving it. The feeling of someone watching me returned worse than before. I tried to ignore it, at least I tried my best, but soon I started losing sleep. Giant bags grew under my eyes and I began yawning almost as much as I breathed. Sarah was very kind enough to let me stay in her house for a few nights. It was during this time that I heard the legend of the Forest Carter, the serial killer who had lived in my house. While no one knows about his exact kill count, Carter was a man with an extremely severe case of narcissism. In his story, it is mentioned that he could not fall asleep if he did not feel like he was being watched. He was finally arrested for putting up a scarecrow to watch him during the night. Only it was not a scarecrow. Carter had in fact murdered a 17-year-old girl just so her corpse could stare him at night. The story gave me shivers literally, and after I went home, I felt like there were hundreds of pairs of eyes just watching me no matter where I turned. A few days later was the first time when I acted out. I was cooking breakfast when I felt the eyes watching me, and this time the feeling was so immense that it could just crumble me. Instinctively, out of fear, I threw my kitchen knife, which lodged itself into the wall, which was a huge surprise for me because I know that kitchen knives are not very sharp. When I pulled it out, it had formed a small hole in the wall, so out of curiosity, I took a peep inside. I was not expecting anything because it was a wall, but I found myself shivering in the horror as I took a look inside. I found myself staring at a pair of eyes in a pickle jar, as if they were preserved for a science lab experiment. In just a few hours, I saw police peel away the dry walls of my house, starting with the kitchen. They found a total of 152 pair of eyes in little glass jars preserved. The scariest thing was that each and every one was staring at me, or at least I felt like that.